Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Oswald, National Press Club Press Freedom Team Lead and a foreign policy reporter for CQ Roll Call. We are so glad you are joining us today for a discussion that, unfortunately, has become a particularly timely issue for journalists to be thinking about: what safety and legal protections to consider while covering political protests. As you are getting settled in, please check that your chat function, please check your chat function to be sure it's set to everyone, and locate your Q&A button in the lower right corner of your screen. We'll use the Q&A button to take your questions. Political protests and civil unrest are expected to cross America this summer and fall. The combination of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, ongoing right-wing conspiracies about the validity of US elections, and the prospect of further domestic terrorist attacks have produced a climate that forebodes tense confrontations between protesters, counter-protesters, and the police. Journalists are already in the mix covering these clashes, sometimes being mistreated, physically harmed, or even targeted in the process. Our panelists today will explore guidance on staying safe and your legal rights as a journalist while covering conflict. We'll be recording this program and the video will be on our website later today. So if you missed something, don't worry, you'll have a chance to catch it a second time. We hope you'll have questions. Please share them anytime in the Q&A and any experiences you've had in the chat. We'll be monitoring them and respond to some questions as we go along while saving time at the end for more questions. And now it is my deep pleasure to introduce our panelists. Corinne Chin, an Emmy Award-winning video journalist and Associated Press Director of News Talent. Kamisha Laurie, who is the Borealis Racial Equity and Journalism Fund Legal Fellow for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And Mickey Ostreicher, General Counsel for the National Press Photographers Association. To begin today's conversation, we'll be hearing from Kamisha, who will update us on the current domestic legal environment facing journalists covering political protests. Over to you, Kamisha.
Sure. One second, let me pull up my screen. But hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the introduction, Rachel. I am absolutely honored to be invited by the National Press Club Journal Institute to speak on this panel today. And I'm just thrilled to share with you all resources and tips that you can use when you're on the field covering protests. One second while I move this to full screen. Okay, can everyone see that? Hopefully. Okay, good. Okay, so again, my name is Kamisha Laurie, and I am the Racial Equity and Journalism Fellow at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. If you don't know who Rcfp is, we are a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to protecting First Amendment freedoms and the news gathering rights of journalists, as well as provide pro bono legal resources just to help you navigate the journalism/media law space. So I am looking at the Zoom participants, and I'm just happy to see so many of you joining us today. It says 84 people, so that's exciting. Just because, as Rachel mentioned, we are living in a time where our political climate is a little wonky based on several contributors. For example, according to the US Press Freedom Tracker, journalists covering protests are subject to an average of 1.6 assaults per day, with more than 85% perpetrated by law enforcement. So we estimate that in the months ahead, journalists will likely again provide important coverage of demonstrations tied to reproductive freedoms and gun rights, and face numerous challenges along the way. So just to start this presentation off, I just want to share with you all some more information and stats concerning what's happening on the field to journalists and protesters, as well as provide free resources you can use to protect yourself. So, starting with the next slide. Let's take a look at the stats. So what exactly is going on today at these protests? Specifically, what is happening to the journalists or photojournalists who are trying to report and cover protests? A great way to find this information out is simply by utilizing the US Press Freedom Tracker, which you can see that I placed in the top left corner of the slide. Essentially, it's a website that covers a wide variety of information relating to the number of journalists facing charges or the number of reporters assaulted, to even perhaps the number of journalists stopped at the US border and asked to hand over their electronics. It's a very easy website to find. Just Google US Press Freedom Tracker, and it should be the first or second link that comes up. And then once you hit that link on Google, Bing, Yahoo search, whatever search engine that you are using, you'll be directed to a page that looks like the one displayed here. As you can see, the data shows us that all the reported protests that occurred since 2017. And this data can be organized by year or by the type of protests occurring that year. For instance, if you look on the top left, you see tabs that separate the type of protests. So you have a tab for all incidents, reproductive rights, protests, and the election 2020. And if you're thinking like, hey, where's the tab addressing the protests relating to racial equality, that could probably be found in the general protests tab. So today we're going to use the tracker to analyze protests for the year 2019 through 2022. All right, so starting with 2019, you can see this little map in the center, and the location for protest incidents that took place that year were pretty spread out nationally, and most journalists were targeted at the beginning of the year, January and February. And also you can see there's a spike in May and August. And as you can see by the data, there were 9 arrests of journalists and criminal charges, 42 journalists were assaulted, 30 received subpoenas, 22 was denied access, 18 journalists were stopped at the border with their equipment, and 12 had their equipment damaged. And although these numbers seem alarming, little did we know that 2020's data would shake the journalism world to the core. So let's look at 2020. I know you all remember what happened then, or maybe you don't. Don't worry, I'll refresh you. And 2020, looking at these stats, they're pretty high. So 143 journalists were arrested or faced criminal charges. 627 journalists were assaulted. 121 had their equipment damaged. 35 journalists were subpoenaed. 14 were denied access to report in certain places, and 27 had their equipment searched or seized. And as you can see by the infographics, most of the incidents occurred 2020, which is the summer that had the height of the Black Lives Matter movement protests in response to ongoing news footage covering unjust killings of Black men and women and incidents of police brutality. In 2021, the adverse press incidents seemed to significantly drop in number compared to 2020, but the numbers were still pretty high in comparison to the data in 2019. See, if you look at the number of journalists that were assaulted, it was 144 in 2021 compared to 627 in 2020. So what do the numbers look like today? Well, clearly we're still in 2022. That means the numbers are still growing, and we hope that if you have experienced or have any negative impacts or negative experiences when you attended a protest, that you were reported to the US Press Freedom Tracker just to make sure the numbers are accurate as possible. But according to the current stats, only 10 journalists have been arrested and criminally charged so far. 21 journalists have been assaulted, 14 have been subpoenaed, and 6 have been denied access. However, like I mentioned earlier, you can separate the data out by protest topics. So on the right side, you see that I separated the data out and clicked on the tab reproductive rights. So all of the abortion protests And you can see that 8 journalists were reported to be arrested and criminally charged, 9 assaulted, and 2 had their equipment damaged. And here's another slide that really does a great job highlighting what is going on in the news today and why we believe that presenting this topic today is just so urgent. On June 24th, the Supreme Court released its opinion in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And essentially they overturned Roe versus Wade, which was pivotal in codifying 50 years of reproductive rights in the United States. This led to numerous protests outbreaking all across our nation. One particular news outlet, which you see in the middle here, reported that 181 abortion rights protesters outside were arrested, and at least 12 journalists were assaulted or detained while covering the protests. Another reporter from the LA Taco Reporter voiced their opinion by saying, in terms of press freedom rights, it was probably one of the worst protests I've been at. And he's referring to this article on the right, which was tweeted out. And this is where he was assaulted by police when he was trying to cover a reproductive rights protests. So now that I presented these daunting statistics, I hope I didn't scare you or deter you from reporting, because that's not my goal. My goal is just to make sure you're aware of the risks and the legal challenges you could potentially face when you're out there on the field. And I want to give you those resources to overcome those challenges. So the first resource is my organization's bread and butter, our fame to claim, our North Star. This is Rcfp's legal defense hotline. So if you are in need of legal assistance and don't know who to call or what to do, call us on the hotline. We have staff waiting on the other end to assist you. If you're lucky, I might be on the hotline for a particular week, personally answering your phone call. But we're available 24/7. And a good example of this is when the Capitol riots occurred, we had attorneys on call in DC and in 7 states who needed help when they were arrested or faced an imminent threat of arrest. And the number for the hotline you can see below, or if you're not a fan of talking on the phone, you can just fill out our hotline form and we'll be able to respond to you at your time of need. And just a few stats about the hotline. In 2021, we had 584 calls to the hotline, and that covered 46 states and international jurisdictions. And 45% of the requests in 2021 were related to public records. So you can see what people are interested in. And maybe you're still like, I still don't know why I need to call the hotline. These are some frequently asked hotline questions that come on the hotline. But the hotline is definitely a great source to you guys, especially if you're out on the field and you're arrested, or maybe you don't know how to prepare for a protest. You can call us and we can literally give you rundown, step-by-step tips on what to do when you're about to go report on a protest. And next, specifically relating to covering protests, Rcfp has a ton of legal guides on our website that cover a variety of First Amendment topics, but these 3 here are pertinent to the conversation today. These are all available at rcfp.org, or Rachel can send you all the links after the presentation. But the first one here is the Protect Yourself When Covering a Protest pamphlet. It's just a more condensed version of the conversation we're having today, and you can print it out or keep it electronically on your phone. Just carry it with you everywhere if you can. It's simple, it's small, you can refer to it. And then we have the Police Protest in the Press, which is a more expansive version of today's conversation in a legal guide format. And in the middle, we have the First Amendment Handbook. Rcfp has recognized that many journalists simply do not know when they need an attorney or maybe they don't have access to an attorney when they have a pressing legal question. So this handbook acts as a basic primer that is there just to educate anyone on the basics of the laws that affect reporters' rights to gather and report the news. Finally, other resources that I think would be helpful is some practical advice about covering high conflict news stories by the NPPA, Physical Safety Civil Disorder by CPJ, and Citizens Guide to Reporting Police. And again, we'll send you the links when the presentation ends today. So I am now done, so I can turn it back to you, Rachel, to introduce Corinne.
Thanks, Kamisha. Corinne, can you now take us to some of the safety tips for journalists and editors and producers as they're planning their coverage?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Kamisha, for really setting the stage on why we need to talk about this today in 2022 with everything that's going on. So my name is Corinne Chin. I am the Director of News Talent for Recruitment at the Associated Press currently. But for most of my career, I was a video journalist in the field. Most of that I spent at the Seattle Times. But prior to that, I was a freelance video journalist, a very young, inexperienced freelance video journalist, covering a lot of protests, actually. I had covered protests in Nairobi, Kenya, in Johannesburg. I covered protests before the World Cup in Brazil. But none of those protests were quite like the protests that I experienced back here at home in the States in Seattle, Washington. And today I am going to take you through a case study of those protests that Kamisha referenced earlier, the George Floyd protests in Seattle, Washington. I'm also going to encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A function, as well as the chat if that is easier for you. I'm really going to be going through these pretty quickly. I just want to spur some questions because I think really where the learning will happen today is in the Q&A, in the discussion with the two wonderful legal experts that I have as co-panelists with me today. So don't be worried if I breeze through this. There's a lot of resources out there where you can review. But first, I want you to meet my Seattle Times colleagues at the time, Ramon Dampour and Amanda Snyder. Ramon on the left, of course, and Amanda in that green jacket on the right, and I'm over there all the way on the right in the turquoise. But this is us on May 30th, 2020. So it's about 1 p.m. Ramon and I, Ramon's also a video journalist, we returned to the newsroom to eat lunch. We'd have just filmed a peaceful protest at police headquarters. We were very relieved the crowd was nothing like what we saw in Minneapolis earlier that week. The next protest is downtown at 3. Amanda's in the newsroom. She asks if she can ride to that protest with us after she files her photos, and we agree. Amanda doesn't finish filing her photos until around 2:30 p.m., but we're too busy enjoying lunch to notice the time or be worried. Ramon drives us all downtown, but the crowd is massive and streets are blocked. It's now 2:45 p.m. There's no time to find parking. Ramon tells us to hop out while he parks the car and he'll find us later. So what should Amanda and I do next? Should we hop out of the car? We'll share a location on the phone with the phone function with Ramon so he can catch up with us. Or should we insist on finding a parking spot together so we don't get separated? But we'll risk missing the moment, which would mean the Seattle Times won't have any relevant coverage. So go ahead, fill out the poll, and in a few seconds here, we'll see what you all said. Let's see those results. Okay, 71% of you think we should insist on finding a parking spot together. And 30% of you would hop out of the car and separate from Ramon. Now, I think that it's clear that we know which is the safer choice, right? We should stick together. But I'm glad that 30% of you were honest about what you would actually do as journalists in the heat of the moment in that situation, which is what Amanda and I did. We hopped out of the car and we were kettled right away. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with kettling, it is when it's a police formation, when you are encircled by police officers with the intent of arresting everyone within the perimeter of that circle. Now, if you look at the bottom left of the screen, that red circle, that's me. You can see just a hint of my turquoise jacket, the hood of my jacket there. Amanda and I are there pinned up against that building on the left, which is the Nordstrom flagship. This photo was taken by my friend Laura Kleiss, who was there that day, a little bit further out of the crowd. You probably know this is a situation no journalist wants to be in. And what happened to Ramon? So Ramon, he did park the car. He couldn't find any parking. He ended up parking underneath that Nordstrom. And he had our location, but he ended up on this street corner you see right here, which is across the Nordstrom. So what happened was that we were separated. And I'm about to show a clip of what happened next. And just as a heads up, there are some loud sounds in this clip. So I apologize. I think the sound was not playing for the first half, but you get the idea. It was very chaotic. There was a lot of tear gas. That clip was filmed by my former colleague, Mike Baker, who's at the New York Times. So what could we have done to prepare better? I think this is kind of the moment that many of you have been waiting for. And I also want to say what I'm going to be talking about today is a pretty narrow slice of what safety is and should be. I'm going to talk about what we can do as individual journalists. And I think we're going to widen out that conversation later on to talk about what we can do as colleagues and collectively. But as a journalist, maybe you're a freelancer, maybe this is your first protest. What can you do? Research, right? Research. Scout your locations ahead of time. If you can, if it's local, visit the location ahead of time to scope out choke points, possible exit routes. Even if it is a location that's familiar to you, maybe it's set up for a rally or an event and there are blockages that you might not know about. You can't visit ahead of time. Great resources, Google Maps, Google Earth, even Snap Map. See what people are posting on Snapchat in that area and how people are interacting with that location. And really importantly, determine your team's meeting points. I'm going to talk about an admin point. So let's say you're at Westlake Park in Seattle. It is super crowded. The cell networks are down. How do you check in with your team? Well, you can have an admin point ahead of time. So I can say we are going to meet in front of the Gap every half an hour when things get crazy. And you have to stick to that and you have to respect that because otherwise we don't know if the rest of the team is safe. What if the Gap is compromised? What if there is a police car on fire in front of the Gap, which happened? Well, then you will go to your security point, which is a predetermined point away, a little bit further removed from where you expect action to be that has not been compromised. So those are things that are really important to talk about with your team ahead of time. And of course, figuring out parking. We should have thought about that a little bit further in advance. But what happened was we parked underground in that situation. And when the riot was declared and a curfew was declared, we couldn't get our car. We couldn't access our car. So we might as well have not had a car. So think about where you park. Is there a place that you can park that is a little more protected from some potential violence that may occur? So maybe a garage that wouldn't fall within that perimeter. Is there a place where you can back into the spot so that you can pull out right away if you need to make a pretty quick escape? Other things to research: cultural norms for the physical spaces you'll be in, but also for the people you'll be reporting alongside. And I think this is something that's often overlooked when we talk about safety is how might things be interpreted? What's the best way to communicate with people? What might offend people? What might make people feel unsafe? And a lot of this is identity based, and especially If you are reporting in a location that's unfamiliar to you, especially in another country, this is something that's really important to prepare for. Also researching power structures. Different states have different structures, and especially different countries. And that can include police, military, but also political structures. What are some of the groups that are particularly antagonizing to journalists? Are there any social or racial factors at play that might change the power dynamics? What to plan? Plan your comp strategy. What are you going to do if you can't just pick up your phone and call and text? So again, designated check-in times, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Set an alarm on your phone so you don't miss those. This can be really important in a really hairy situation. Determine how will you communicate with your colleagues and your editor. Are you going into a situation where it's important that your messaging is encrypted? Maybe you don't use the text messaging on your phone. Maybe you want to use Signal or some other tool. This is something that the whole team, not just the team on the ground, but the team back in the newsroom should agree on in advance. What if cell networks go down? What will you use? Sometimes walkie-talkies are appropriate and will work. Everything again is a case-by-case basis. Are you going to be in a situation where you want to turn off your biometric unlocking? Do you expect to be detained? Whether you're kettled, whether you're crossing the border, maybe you want to disable those features on your device. Maybe you want to bring a different device. Also in advance, really important to talk about risk tolerance with your team. How will you signal you're ready to leave that scenario, that you're no longer able to work safely, that you're no longer able to do the great reporting and journalism that you're sent there to do? And also respect that, if you are working with people who are ready to leave. What will you do if they don't respect that? Are you just going to go? Are you going to wait for them? These are conversations to have in advance. What to bring? Bring your emergency contact info. I'm going to go back a little bit. Some people write in Sharpie their one number on themselves before they go out to a demonstration. But that might be something you want to bring printed out as well if you save it on your phone, depending on your access to your devices. Always bring your identification, bring your press pass. Consider, depending on who is present at the event, do you want to be wearing that? Do you want to be announcing to everyone that you're a journalist? Or do you want to have it quickly accessible in your front pocket? One thing I always recommend is don't wear it around your neck, because that can be easily used to grab and choke you in a situation where there's a dangerous crowd. What do you wear? Think about what that looks like. Are you wearing colors that signal affiliation with a group? But also think about practicality. Are you wearing closed-toed shoes that you can run in? Are you wearing natural fibers, or are you wearing synthetics, which if you are in a situation where there's a fire or an explosion, those can melt to your skin and really hurt you? And then of course your PPE, your COVID PPE, but in the event of tear gas, a respirator and a pair of goggles. Maybe you need body armor. And depending on the risks, a first aid or medical kit and a buddy. And this is something that I talk about a lot. I think it's really important to be on teams if possible. And I know that if you're a freelancer, this can be really hard, that this can be tough also if you are working for a news organization that doesn't feel they have the resources to send multiple people out. But consider linking up with other freelancers, consider linking up with other colleagues just as a safety measure. So this is a photo of me and Ramon leaving a protest in the evening by my colleague Erica Schultz. And this is a photo of Erica by Ramon. And so in this scenario, Ramon was assigned simply to be Erica's back watcher. You can see it's a pretty tense situation. He wasn't there to gather footage, although he broke the rules and took this one photo. But he was really there to be her eyes and ears, because when she has all this equipment on and the tear gas is out and the rubber bullets are flying, she really has limited use of her senses. This is going to be really quick, so just go ahead and take a screen grab. I always recommend doing a risk assessment before going out. It feels really boring, but this is really how you prepare. And you do it by outlining your hazards, who's at risk, your risk rating, the likelihood of that, and the risk mitigation. So go ahead, take a screen grab of this. If you miss it, feel free to reach out to me. It will be available, it's on the recording. But what that looked like for the protest, the case study that I walked through, let's just take one example. Tear gas was a hazard. Who was at risk? Myself, my ability to communicate with Amanda and Ramon. What was the risk rating or impact of that? If I had no mitigation, pretty moderate risk. Tear gas is pretty debilitating if you've experienced it. If I did have mitigation, if I had my mask and goggles on, kind of minor, I could still work. Likelihood, certain and imminent, because Seattle police use it liberally. And then, of course, you write your risk mitigation, what you'll bring, what you'll do to prepare for that. I am going to stop here for time, and there's going to be a link that we'll share out with more in-depth tips on how you can keep yourself safe in a protest situation, a webinar that I had done with the IWMF. So I'd encourage you to look at that if you're interested in more tips. But before I hand it off to Mickey, I just wanted to add what Mickey's about to talk about, I think is so important for safety, even though it's not, put on your gear and go. We really need to think about creating a culture of safety collectively, of keeping each other safe as journalists, of not necessarily seeing each other as competitors in the heat of the moment, but also keeping the people we cover safe, because that really impacts, down the line, whether we're safe doing our work. Are we keeping them safe? Do people trust us? Are we building the trust in the correct areas? So thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Corinne. I wish we had more time to go through all of those things. That was a wealth of knowledge, and I really hope our attendees do follow up and do that risk mitigation assessment. Mickey, what kind of more specific advice do you have for our visual journalists in terms of how they do their risk assessments and the challenges they may be facing?
Great. So I just started sharing my screen. Can you see that? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So my name's Mickey Ostreicher. I'm the General Counsel of the National Press Photographers Association. NPPA has been around since 1946. We're the voice of visual journalists. But before becoming a lawyer, I was a photographer, a photojournalist in print and broadcast. That's me as a student, working in a newspaper and then a television. And I've also been a uniform reserve sheriff's deputy for about the same amount of time, for a little over 40 years. I do a lot of training with law enforcement. I love doing it with journalists, but as I soon came to realize, telling journalists what their rights are, when journalists say, I know my rights, that's oftentimes the last sentence that they get to utter before hearing, turn around, put your hands behind your back, you're under arrest, if they even get that courtesy. So I spend a great deal of time training law enforcement about these First Amendment rights that I'm going to talk about. And so everybody is familiar with that. Congress shall make no law abridging, and then it goes on to a number of clauses, and we're going to be talking about the press and speech clause, also the right to assemble and the right for redress of grievances. And, people ask me all the time, well, what is speech, freedom of speech? How does that play into the First Amendment? And basically, it works like this. Photography, videography has been deemed to be a form of expression. Without free expression, you can't have free speech. And that's how the act of photographing and recording is covered by that. Obviously, the press freedom is pretty self-evident. But the First Amendment is an absolute. It's what's known as being subject to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. And those restrictions must be content neutral. So in other words, what you're doing, what your message is, shouldn't make any difference as to how the government applies. And when we talk about the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no law, but that has been deemed to apply to any state actor, police departments, mayors, common council, anybody that has the power of the government to impact your First Amendment rights. It doesn't mean another person or a private entity. It only applies to them. But getting back to the restrictions, they must be content neutral, they must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant governmental interest, and they must leave open a reasonable alternative avenues of communication. The other things that come into play in the Bill of Rights are the Fourth Amendment being protected against unreasonable search and seizure, not only of your property, but of your person. And then the 14th Amendment in terms of due process and equal protection. And they all interact with each other when you're covering a protest. The other big thing that comes into play, I don't have it listed here, is the Privacy Protection Act of 1980, which protects journalists' work product from being seized. Police cannot use, or they should not use, a warrant. They need to get a subpoena when they do that. And the real important thing that governs pretty much everything out on the street when you're photographing and recording is the fact that there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in a public place. And this is why we're photographed and recorded scores of times a day by surveillance cameras, by police dash cams, body cams, why we can take pictures of police, and why we can take pictures of other people that are out in a public place, if they're protesters, any of that. And that's the important thing to remember. Some information additionally, and I'll get back to some of the other points, is I was on the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a public recording of police committee. This is the link to it. It's all readily available. And it's training manuals. It's also student manuals, but it's got quite a number of things in there that deal with the right to record. You know, being out there, there were some great tips by Corinne, but, you know, maintaining a sense of humor. I can't tell you, out of all the press credentials I have, my laminated get out of jail free card really often broke the ice from the Monopoly set. So there's my information. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can. There we go. And give me 1 second. So a number of things that you can think about. I know one of the questions that we had was, who is a journalist? And if I had the answer to that question, I probably could just retire and go somewhere else. Journalists ask me that question all the time, but more importantly, police ask me that question. And it's really, really hard in this day and age to define who is a journalist. Back in the day when I was out on the street, if somebody was out there like me running around with 3 Nikons around my neck, or then a big beta cam on my shoulder, and nobody else had cameras, there were no cell phones, there was none of that, it was pretty obvious who the press was. That is not true at all these days. Everybody's got a cell phone. Every cell phone has a camera. Unfortunately, you know, when you get sent out on assignment, even if you're a reporter, you're often asked to shoot video, shoot pictures. You're usually using your cell phone. You look like everybody else. You look like the other protesters. Again, you know, Corinne talked about credentials. We found so many situations where journalists have been attacked by protesters because the protesters didn't want them photographing or recording them. So journalists oftentimes would not display anything on their vest, on a helmet that said press. They'd hide their credentials. You really do need to put it somewhere if you've got them that's accessible. You need to decide when to display them and when to keep them hidden. You're only going to probably learn that when you're experienced and get out there. It's really tough being thrown into covering a major protest for the first time. But you'll learn, hopefully, and learn the easy way rather than the hard way, which is getting injured, getting arrested, getting tear gassed. Those things are real personal decisions. Everybody says, well, where should I draw the line? If an officer says, you need to leave, you need to disperse, that's your job. You're there to photograph, record, report, observe. When do you do it? When do you comply? Give me your camera, turn off the phone, don't record anymore. All of those things are personal decisions, and nobody really can prepare you to, at that moment, decide whether you're going to comply, whether you're going to retreat, whether you know your rights or not. Being handcuffed and put in the back of a police car, you're not going to get any good images that way if that's what you're out there to do. And oftentimes, even though we're talking about this, it can go from 0 to 60 instantly, where you don't hear anything, you're never told to disperse, you're never told to leave, and then all of a sudden you're grabbed by a police officer and detained, cuffed, arrested, forced to leave the area. All of those things can happen instantly. So I can't stress enough having situational awareness. Do not get tunnel vision if you're using a camera. Do not only look through the viewfinder. Look around you. Be aware of what's happening. Police often use bikes to create that kettling. Watch them, watch their movements, watch if police are starting to encircle you, and look for a way out. These are things to really keep track of in terms of working. I think I saw somebody, what about if you're a freelancer and you're working alone? Try not to work alone. Always keep recording. That's another thing that's really important. Even if you're not getting great video, if you have another device that can record, even if you're only getting audio, if you get arrested, there's the presumption that a police officer, if they end up having to testify in court, is telling the truth. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. So if you've got a recording of what happened, that's really always important to have that. Just be aware that there are many places, there's been a number of lawsuits since the George Floyd protests where it's been deemed, in particular in Minnesota, that journalists are not required to disperse after an order of dispersal. That in most cases, when there are curfews set up, that governors in their executive order will exempt the press as being essential personnel. But then we're back to the question of who is press. And as I started to say, aside from the problem of press doesn't look necessarily like it used to, you've got a lot of people who are not press, who are actually protesting, who are creating violence, who are doing unlawful acts, and they've written press on their shirts or their helmets, or they've made up phony press credentials, or a number of things, which really, again, creates more of a problem for journalists and in police trying to sort out who's a journalist. So be aware of that. In a number of states, there are state shield laws, reporters' privilege laws, which protect journalists, but they also identify kind of the class of journalists. Some of them are up to date. Some of them are very antiquated. As I said, in Minnesota, they came out in a settlement of a civil rights lawsuit with indicia, what they called indicia of being a journalist. And they talked about people, again, carrying a press pass or press badge or professional equipment. Again, as we talked about, that's not necessarily always the case. So it's going to be really difficult. I think the thing that will keep you in best stead is for you to maintain that situational awareness. The one last thing that I just wanted to talk about is this whole idea of the right to record. The Supreme Court has never ruled on it. They've never said one way or another whether there is a First Amendment right to photograph and record police performing their official duties in a public place. But quite a number of circuits have. So the 1st, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, the 9th, and the 11th, all of the odd numbered circuits. So it's really good if you check and see what jurisdiction you're in. Those circuits cover a number of states. But just last week, the 10th Circuit became the first even numbered circuit to clearly establish that the right to record is there. And clearly establish is an important legal standard, because when law enforcement officers in particular are sued for violating someone's constitutional, their civil rights, the first thing they assert is qualified immunity. And in order to overcome qualified immunity, journalists or any plaintiff needs to show two things. One, that there was a constitutional right in place, and two, that that right was in place and it was clearly established at the time of the incident so that any reasonable police officer would know that he or she was violating that right at that time. And if those things can be proved, the officers don't get qualified immunity and the lawsuit is able to move forward. But the whole idea here and all of our participation in today's meeting is to try to have that not happen to you. And we can give you all the training in the world, but again, the best thing for you to do is be out there, have situational awareness, work with other folks, keep recording. Those are some of the key things. And I think, that turn it back to Rachel, and hopefully we'll be able to deal with any other things that come up here and answer some of your questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Mickey. That was a lot of really, really useful information. I specifically liked what you recommended for journalists to check the local rules beforehand of their jurisdiction, their state, their city. This localizing this is going to be really important to having the information that you need to keep yourself safe.
And the one more thing that I wanted to add to play off of what Corinne said in terms of body armor, personal protective devices, you really need to be aware of the rules. New York State, after the shooting in Buffalo, just passed a law that the governor signed that prohibited anyone other than police and peace officers and certain other professions like EMTs, things like that, from possessing, owning, selling body armor. It's something that we are working on in New York State to get an exemption for journalists, because we think it's not only important for them to be protected to cover things here, but oftentimes when they're sent overseas to cover, high conflict areas, the only place that they can get the body armor is in the United States. They can't get it overseas. And that in itself becomes a misdemeanor. So be aware of that. During the political conventions, they had a thing that people couldn't carry backpacks, they couldn't carry gas masks. We actually worked with authorities, with the Reporters Committee, to make sure that they modified those rules and understood them. But really, you need to be very aware of local rules, because you could be out there peacefully doing your job, and by wearing body armor or having a gas mask or something else, you also all of a sudden could be arrested for violating some type of local ordinance that you're not aware of.
Vicky, I also wanted to bring your attention to the Q&A chat. You had a clarifying question regarding dispersal orders. Someone wants to know, is dispersal orders by state? Is there a federal law? What are dispersal orders?
So when police declare an unlawful assembly, in other words, there is no lawful purpose anymore for those people to be there. They will declare the unlawful assembly and then are supposed to give people a certain amount of time to disperse. And they will say, if you do not disperse in 5 minutes, you may be subject to less lethal munitions, where they will fire off tear gas or use OC spray or do other things, use an LRAD. If you ever see this big device on the back of a truck that looks like a huge radar installation, it's not. It basically creates this piercing sound that people are not going to be able to stay in the area unless they have some kind of ear protection. It's just unbearable. So, back to your question, Kamisha, it really depends on the place that you're in, the jurisdiction that you're in. As I said, in Minnesota, the courts have found that journalists will not be subject to dispersal orders. That doesn't mean that they're not subject to those reasonable time, place, manner. So if you're, let's say, out in the street in the middle of a protest, the police may say, anybody who remains in the street will be subject to arrest, and they should be able to provide journalists with direction. Like if you guys stand on the sidewalk, they may let you in back of police lines. Another big suggestion, and I'm sorry I didn't mention it, but this just refreshes my recollection. Have conversations with your local police. Beforehand. Trying to figure all this out in the heat of a riot, the heat of a protest, is never going to be productive. So if you know that there are going to be protests, if there are going to be demonstrations, but even not, you should be establishing communications with the public information officer, the PIO at a police agency. You should have and build a relationship. And when I do the training with police, I suggest and urge them to reach out to journalists to do the same thing, so that there's some kind of at least framework for these rules of engagement, where officers hopefully for the most part will know what they can and what they can't do with journalists. Journalists will know what is expected of them, and each will be able to fulfill their role in society to a much greater extent. I mean, the one thing that everybody needs to keep in mind is that the First Amendment isn't necessarily there to protect the press. It's there to protect the public's right to receive this information. And the press is the one that does it. So I realize it's a long-winded answer, but everything that's legal, it's always more complicated than a simple yes or no.
Thank you for that, Mickey. That was a lot of good information you managed to get out in a pretty quick amount of time. I wish we could talk more, and we are almost out of time, but I did want to put a question to Corinne. And if Kamisha, you have any thoughts on this as well, please jump in. But there have been a lot of questions, comments in the chat about protesters and how they view the press, particularly when we're trying to take photographs. Corinne, you talked about creating a culture of safety. So journalists are not seen as in order to decrease the risks of protesters, counter-protesters seeing journalists as adversaries. Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, I have a lot more thoughts on this than I can say in the next 3 or 4 minutes, but I really think that the way we conduct ourselves as journalists in the field is really important. And making sure that you have informed consent to the extent that it is possible, not just going, and this is what is creating that lack of trust, right? Is the people who go shove the camera in people's faces, who are going and, being very disrespectful. We're going and just making pictures of the chaos and maybe not speaking to the reason for that in the captions. I think that we could all maybe challenge ourselves to take one more step and be a little more intentional in our storytelling and our reporting. One thing that came up a lot in the chat is the idea of surveillance, and that police are using our images to identify people that they want to pursue. And that has also created a lot of distrust. And so I think that to the extent that we can be conscious of what is it that we're making pictures of, what is it that we're publishing, and why, and what is our objective, and just to be thoughtful about that step instead of just, spraying the shutter and putting it out there for the sake of letting people know, but what is it that we want to let people know? So I think we can just have more conversations about that as an industry, about what does it mean, and I'm not saying that we need to go to every single person in our pictures and get their life story and get a release form signed. That is not what I'm saying. I know that we still have to do our jobs, but I do think that there are things that we can do collectively to be a little bit more thoughtful about it.
If I could just add to that, and this is a huge debate that goes on, and which is why I stressed, when you're out in public, there's no reasonable expectation of privacy. There's a huge difference between the right to photograph and record in public and what we do with those images afterwards. You can't use them commercially without a model release. But what we do here as journalists is editorial work. You do not need a model release. You do not need consent. And I think, unfortunately, there is this climate out there where people can think that they can say to journalists, you don't have consent to take my picture, therefore don't take it, or delete those images, or I'm going to break your camera. I mean, that depending on how it's done, is assault. Certainly somebody can come up to you nicely and say, listen, I'd really prefer not to be photographed. And as a good person, you might take that into consideration. Of course, if you've just photographed somebody who's thrown a trash can through a plate glass window, and then they go, hey, I don't want to be recorded, they should have thought about what they were doing before they did it. The big thing is we don't want to be seen as an arm of law enforcement. I'm constantly saying it's not the job of journalists to do the work of police. And the NPPA, I know the Reporters Committee and many others will help journalists when their images are being subpoenaed. People are entitled to what's published. They're not entitled to what's unpublished unless they get a subpoena and the court agrees that those images need to be turned over. So again, I totally agree with Corinne. We could probably talk about this for quite a long time, but I know there's a big difference now in terms of whether you need consent or not. And at least my position and PPA's position is, as a journalist, you don't need consent of anyone to photograph and record them. But as part of the editorial process, you can discuss and decide what images get published.
And thanks, Mickey, for jumping in, because that's definitely what I was trying to get at. And I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing, like, yeah, I think that, again, I think there were not enough minutes to really parse my answer there. I think that, yeah, we need to defend our rights as journalists, but I mean, I think we've all seen, those of us who've been out in the field, people who are going out and putting all of us as journalists at risk just by the way they're conducting themselves, or not making the decisions editorially in the way that is as responsible as Mickey is describing.
All right. Well,
Oh, sorry, Rachel.
please, Misha, please why don't you give us the closing comment before I do the wrap up?
Oh, okay. I was just going to add to Corinne's point that she said earlier, was just to be prepared in advance and do your research accordingly. And what I mean by that is, like, we all have access to the news every day. We're all on social media. Let's be real. You see what's happening at protests. If you're honestly keep seeing protesters being tear gassed or maybe shot with rubber bullets, then you know, hey, maybe if I really want to cover this protest, let me get the protective goggles. Let me get the armor, chest armor, body armor. You know, prepare yourself in advance. But I guess in closing, please, 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 please rely on the resources that we have for you, the free resources, the legal guides, the protest safety pamphlet. That will summarize everything that we mentioned here, just in case you weren't able to take notes. And again, call the Rcfp hotline if you just really don't know what to do, or you don't have an attorney to be on the ground locally and you want one. Please just utilize all these resources. They are free. And we want to see all of you guys succeed and be safe, of course.
Absolutely. We went through a lot of material today. Please definitely do watch out for a recording of this video, as well as links to more of the resources that were touched on here today. I want to again reiterate my thanks to Corinne and Kamisha and Mickey for sharing and you all saw it, their really expansive expertise, their experiences and tips for how we can personally and professionally handle protest coverage. Thank you to all of our participants for all of the great questions and sharing of personal experience in the chat today. I'm sorry we weren't able to address all of them live. On behalf of the National Press Club Journalism Institute and the Press Freedom Team, thank you again for being here. Stay well, and thank you all again. We will see you soon, we hope. Bye.
Thank you.